Hey, happy Sunday afternoon, all. I've used this Facebook feed camera. I'm never quite sure when it is coming on live for the feed, so a couple of hellos. Good afternoon. Sunday afternoon, the 19th of April today. Midst of the shutdown for safety involving the coronavirus pandemic due to the lack of leadership of the President of the United States and the federal government to get sufficient word out and testing out in time for us to be prepared for a medical crisis. We are all sheltering at home, or some people are out working hard to keep our country fed and safe, and thank you to all of you who are doing so. I am joining with so many others that are doing our bit from home, and as many musicians have inspired me by playing their music from their homes and filling my phone screen and computer screen with goodness. I thought I would provide a audiobook reading live version of Outdoing Jesus. So here it is. I will read for you chapter 6 today, Outdoing Jesus. The subtitle of the book is 7 Ways to Live Out the Promise of Greater Than. I still describe the book with my original subtitle, which is How Ordinary People Are Outdoing Jesus, Why It's Good News, and How You're Likely One of Them. So the idea of the book comes from Jesus' statement in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, those who believe in me will do the works that I'm doing, and they'll do even greater works than these. And it's my contention that the book of John wants us to see Jesus as the start of humanity's new way forward. Jesus as the Son of God is the big brother of humanity and wants all of us to live into the fullness that we see in the example of Jesus, including in what are described as, in the book of John, the 7 miraculous signs. I think they're designed to correspond with the notion of a creation narrative in the 7 days of creation in the book of Genesis. So they're intending to match that story, which was telling you how did we get the nation of Israel in the book of Genesis, and the Gospel of John wanted to say how did we get a way of humanity that comes from following Jesus. And so these 7 miraculous signs are designed to be these 7 days. And so after the 7 of those, Jesus then says, look, those who believe in me, they will do these same works, and they'll do even greater works than these. And that's the way it's supposed to be, that we're meant to see the incarnation not as some miraculous exception, but as a magnificent rule for the way of humanity going forward. So that's how I understand the Gospel of John being structured. That's how I think it's laid out. And all right, so here we go. A reading of the book of John. I think, thank you. I think Vince is now telling me that there was a metronome running that whole time. It was picking up some sort of audio from GarageBand that had a metronome. Thank you, Vince. I appreciate that greatly. I don't think you all want to be listening to a metronome as it ticks off. Look, if you were already hearing that metronome and it was driving you crazy and you were feeling like it was the tick-tock of seconds of your life just passing you by while you sit at home and watch this or anything else on your screens in your house, boy, I'm right there with you. It just feels like time keeps ticking into the future. Yeah. All right. So anyway, this chapter is called Empowerment, that time at the pool. So I include in the book, which I'd love for you to buy your own copy if you want to go to Amazon or go to any other bookseller that can deliver them to your homes, or you could order it to your local bookstore and go pick it up. Those of you in Minneapolis, try that over at Majors and Quinn. If you were to read the book, you would know that each of the chapters have sort of 2 title chapters. One of them is this word that I think grabs the notion of humanity. And I think this is super helpful and important. It's the kind of notions of what kind of a humanity are we talking about. And I think it's made up of celebration, empathy, empowerment, which is one we'll read this time, abundance, fearlessness, participation, and liberation. And I think these 7 are kind of 7 of the essential ways of us all thinking about what kind of a humanity we foresee in the future. and how we want to move forward. So this is the chapter on empowerment, that time at the pool. Hey, by the way, the 7 miracles that are listed as miraculous signs in the Gospel of John, they're only in the Gospel of John. They're all told independently for this gospel. They're not repeated in the others. Sometimes there's some that sound similar to the stories in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John has his own set. And in the Gospel of John, it's designed as its own set on purpose. I think it's a big part of what sets the Gospel of John aside from the others and makes it my favorite of the 4 Gospels. And so this one might strike you somewhat similar to some things you've heard in some of the other ones. It's one of the healing miracles. There's only 3 of the 7 that are healing miracles. So here we go. That time at the pool, chapter 6. And this is the reading that comes from John chapter 5. This is verses 1 through 18. It's one of the longer readings of the actual text, but the text reads like this. After this, there was a Jewish festival, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, near the sheep gate in the north city wall, is a pool with the Aramaic name Bethsaida. It had 5 covered porches, and a crowd of people who were sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed sat there. A certain man was there who had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, knowing that he had already been there for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" Well, the sick man answered him, "Sir, I don't have anyone who can put me in the water when it is stirred up. When I'm lying here to try to get in, someone else gets in ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." Immediately the man was well, and he picked up his mat, and he walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, and the Jewish leaders had said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and you're not allowed to carry your mat." The man answered, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up the mat and walk.'" Well, they inquired, "Who is this man that said to you, 'Pick up the mat and walk'?" The man who had been cured didn't know who it was because Jesus had slipped away into the crowd gathered there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple, and he said, "See, you've been made well. Don't sin anymore in case something worse were to happen to you." The man went and proclaimed to the Jewish leaders that Jesus was the man who had made him well. As a result, the Jewish leaders were harassing Jesus, since he had done these things on the Sabbath. Jesus replied, "My Father is still working, and I am working too. For this reason, the Jewish leaders wanted even more to kill him, not only because he was doing away with the Sabbath, but because he called God his own Father, thereby making himself equal with God. Such an interesting little end to that passage. So that's John 5, 1 through 18. Hey, like all of you, I'm at home doing this work, at least if you're involved in this on April 19th. So you can hear some noise in the back. I can see that my wife is sneaking into the laundry room to try to do some laundry. Go ahead and make all the noise you need to. The good people of the internet will tolerate our laundry banging around down here in the bunker that makes up the hopeful resistance in our basement. All right, so now here into the text. Okay, here we go. I have a confession to make. I have never really liked this story. I'm not entirely sure why, but I've had an apathetic feeling toward it for as long as I can remember, including well into writing this book. Over the past year, while working on the book and telling people I was writing about the 7 miraculous signs in the Gospel of John, I'd forget all about this one. I had a hard time even remembering the details of the story for some reason. They didn't matter much to me, and I suspect that my inability to emotionally connect with it was due to the complexity of the storyline. There are a lot of moving parts in this one. Now, you're going to pick up your own telling of that story. I think there's just so many pieces and jumbled narratives going on in this story. There are a lot of moving parts with this one. There's a man who can't walk. There's a mat. There's a set of pools, a gate, a question, a conversation, a negative response to the healing. I just couldn't find the handholds to keep me invested. Just as I'm not sure what caused my disconnect, I'm not sure what caused that to change. But change it did. I now count this story as one of my favorites of the 7. Perhaps it's because I spent more time in the story and began to see it as one of those signs pointing humanity on a path of a new way of living. But whatever reason, I now see the inherent drama in the story's complexity, and I love it. The subtle, powerful meaning of nearly every sentence has embedded the story deeply into my imagination. I find myself referencing this story in conversations with friends, in counseling situations, and in sermons at what I feel is a level of overdoing it. I'm captured by the sign's clarion call for human empowerment and its explicit critique of a system, especially a religious system, that was concerned more with its own preservation than with benefiting people and human thriving. Subtitle: A word of caution about healing stories. In the miraculous stories in the Gospel of John, Jesus never asks people about the faith at the center of the story, about their faith who are at the center of the story. There is no quid pro quo, a miracle for a statement of faith exchange. Quite the contrary. Those being healed often have no idea what happened or even who healed them. Consider the 3 miraculous signs we've looked at till this point, and keep this in mind as we look at the next 4. In the first miracle, there was a groom who was the beneficiary. He was not even aware that Jesus was involved in the miracle. In the second one, the miracle was performed at a distance, and while the father was aware of Jesus' participation, the son, whose fever actually broke, he was an unknowing beneficiary. In the third miracle, the man at the center of this story didn't know anything about Jesus, not even his name. It was only later, when they connected in the temple, that he was able to identify Jesus as the person who made him well. Don't miss the significance of anonymity in these stories. There is no correlation between the miraculous sign and the person having faith. There's no correlation between the sign and belief in or even knowledge of Jesus. There's not even a hint of the expectation that the recipients of the benefits of these works are connected to their knowledge of or belief in Jesus in any way. In fact, all 7 signs are accomplished without any faith participation from the recipients. To the contrary, most of the time there is considerable confusion about what happened and who did what. Now, in the Gospel of John, there is no for believers only storyline. Now, one of the reasons I like to do the live discussion and reading is not only to try to discuss with any of you that might put comments here on Facebook or send me a text, but I want to make my own comments about the reading, so it's not just an audiobook reading. This, to me, was a really important part of this entire book. I wanted to make this point multiple times. I waited till chapter 6 to make it this explicitly. There is a narrative inside of Christianity that wants to put a belief in Jesus specifically demand on any way to participate in the works and the life of Jesus. And I think it's profoundly damaging to Christianity, and I think it runs contrary to the very gospel of John and Matthew and Mark and Luke, and I think the gospel of Christianity itself. I think the storyline that wants to say that this is explicitly Jesus-centric, or that the person has to be in some sort of faith-holding posture in order to benefit, in the way that we hear from faith healers or we hear from other people that want to sort of put the onus on the recipient, whether that comes through traditional religious teachings of Christianity or through some of this, the power is all in the thing that you say and that you believe, whether that comes from the Christian traditions or from any other traditions, I think is extremely damaging. So this is, I'm going to make the point one more time. I think the Gospel of John wants to provide an alternative to that way of viewing the world. And I think that it really, really matters. And I think what we need to do is see ourselves joining the very path that Jesus is on, the human path of living, the everlasting path of life, the always was and always will be path of life. And that's what all these characters are doing. They're all becoming part of this story. Then their profession of faith follows or doesn't. But the profession of faith follows. It's not a prerequisite. It's not a quid pro quo. And by the way, I wrote this long before we knew that the President of the United States was engaged in all kinds of quid pro quo. So this is not my use of quid pro quo only from the news. But it also just drives me crazy as to why the president would use the federal government's power for his own benefit, because quid pro quos are sort of opposite of the gospel. So here we go. Back to the reading. The pool by the sheep gate. The power and the meaning of this sign are found not only in what happened, a man being healed so that he could stand, walk, and carry his mat, but also in the details of who participated, when it happened, and where it took place. While it might not be evident at first reading, the setting reveals the personal heartache and human empowerment that are at the center of this story. Consider the description from the passage that we read. In Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, in the north city wall, is a pool with the Aramaic name Bethsaida. It has 5 covered porches, and a crowd of people who were sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed sat there. A large pool surrounded by people who suffered from all kinds of maladies paints quite the picture. The reader is drawn into this scene and can imagine the kind of heartache and pain that exists as people, apparently, believe that they would be healed if they got into the pool at precisely when the waters were stirred. Well, the story tells us that this place was near the sheep gate on the north end of the city wall. This gate was used to bring sheep into the temple to be washed and prepared for sacrifice. This was the animals' entrance. This was the place where the sacrifice ritual would begin. We know little about this pool except that it was near the place where the sheep were washed. So it's clear that this was not some healing spa, but perhaps a place for the throwaways of society. At any rate, this is where people who were sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed were sent. In all the time of working on this book and telling people about this story, I would mistakenly refer to it as the, quote, healing of the paralyzed man story. On some level, I guess it was a reasonable assumption. I thought he was paralyzed because the pool is described as a place where people who were sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed sat. My assumption is supported by Jesus saying to the man, pick up your mat and walk. But this story doesn't say the man was paralyzed. It just says that he was sick. A certain man who was there had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him laying there, knowing that he had already been there a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? You see, there's real power and pain in language that generalizes, mischaracterizes, and limits a person. Now, if this were the only time that I had overgeneralized a person's disabilities, I could set it aside as just a Bible reading problem. But frankly, that's not the case. As embarrassing as it is, I must confess that I get uncomfortable being around people with significant physical struggles, and I tend to avoid those situations. That avoidance leads me to not seeing the specifics of people's context and circumstances far too often. The story of the man on the mat is an invitation to reset my, and perhaps your, engagement with assumptions. This is a story about change, about changing a situation, but also about changing a possibility and a power dynamic. Jesus' interaction with this man pulls us even further from our assumptions when he questions the man's understanding and not his physical limitations. Jesus asks him, do you want to get well? Well, how about that for a question? It might strike you as a bit rude or confusing. Perhaps you assume that anyone who's had a sickness that has limited his life would want to get well. But that's not always the case. This man had lived with the condition for 38 years. To cope with long-term chronic conditions, many people make life adjustments and accommodations that can push the pursuit of healing off the list of priorities. I was talking with a friend who struggles from a chronic illness, who had figured out how to live her life with her limitations and found ways to turn it into opportunity. She said that her focus is no longer on, quote, getting better, but on living her life to the fullest. I am in no way suggesting that this man was responsible for his illness. What I am saying is that at some point, a man has the right to simply say, I have chosen my path and I'm not pursuing healing any longer. That can be empowering, But at the same time, it engages what therapists could refer to as learned helplessness. You see, learned helplessness occurs when a person or an animal endures repeatedly painful or otherwise adverse stimuli that is unable to escape or avoid. Research has shown that the increase in 5-HT serotonin activity in the dorsal nucleus plays a critical role in learned helplessness. Other key brain regions involved with the expression of helpless behavior include the basolateral amygdala, central nucleus of the amygdala, and bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. Now, there's words I don't even know how to pronounce. Activity in the medial prefrontal cortex have also been observed during states of helplessness. Quote, Jesus is not coming in with predetermined agenda. He starts by wanting to know if there is something this man wants, something that Jesus can participate in. Empowering another human being with the capacities the person already has is at the heart of the new humanity. This is what makes Jesus' question, "Do you want to get better?" such a kind and gracious one. It does not assume that what he would want for the man is what the man wants for himself. We don't know anything about this man at all from the story. The story doesn't tell us why Jesus picked him or whether or not there was something special about him. The gospel stories are not reserved for people with extraordinary sets of circumstances. This story is a helpful reminder as we deal with other people and the stories that frame their lives. We know shockingly little about what has brought any person to the place that person is in, or about the story of how he or she got there. The stories we tell ourselves about the situation we are in are more important than the particular facts themselves. Even if we think that we know a person very well, we know only bits and pieces of a person's experience. Spouses don't know all there is to know about even their lover of 5 decades. Parents don't know all there is to know about their children's situation or mindset. We don't even know everything we could know about ourselves. In one sense, we are all strangers, even to ourselves. This is why the question, "What do you want?" is crucial to genuine engagement. Asking another person what he or she wants is key to the kind of full human engagement that we're called to on the path that Jesus treads. I'm struck that the man in this story never gives an explicit, "Yes, I want to be well." The man's response, "I don't have anyone who can put me in the water when it is stirred," is heartbreaking. Here is a man who feels he lacks the resources he needs, and he's alone. This is a far too familiar story of someone being isolated and feeling powerless. Often when I'm looking at the stories of the gospel, I like to look at the others and compare notes, as I did with my friend Curdy. A conversation about this miracle led to the discussion about advancements in prosthetics. No longer just a hunk of plastic intended to support some weight or give the appearance of a limb, prosthetics now help people who have lost limbs to use their own neural pathways to move an artificial limb. Curdy said, quote, "The real miracle is the first person who said, 'Even though your leg was blown off, we can find a way for you to walk again.'" I totally got what she was saying. Often, it is having the idea of something being possible that takes the biggest leap of faith. Curdy's a really bright thinker. She's doing graduate studies in hermeneutics of the Gospels. That is what the setting was, why the authors wrote the way they did, what the audience in the first century would have heard in these stories, that sort of thing. Curdy said that when you see in the story of Jesus, what you see in the story of Jesus is the fulfillment of the ancient Jewish imagination, that God wants fullness and wholeness for all of humanity. Quote, "This wholeness is not simply about a foot at the end of the leg. It's about the very idea that you can be made whole." She's on to something important in understanding the sign in this story. Jesus introduces a changed storyline, one that has the man getting up and walking. What Jesus brings to the situation is a perspective that shifts the story from what the man doesn't have to what he does have. the desire and means to get up. I hear an empathic tone in Jesus' question, do you want to get well? Jesus said to the man, get up, pick up your mat and walk. Jesus doesn't lean over to the man and pull him in close to the water and often to wait with him until the water is stirred. He replaces the I don't have what I need story with the use your strength to get up and carry your mat story. It is as if Jesus is saying to the man, do you have a vision for not sitting by this pool? Pick up your mat and carry it. Subheading, calling people off their mats by calling them onto their mat. People all over the world are doing this kind of work in helping people find new stories so that they can be freed from limiting bondages keeping them down. This is what you would see if you went to the Oak Fit Gym outside of Dallas, Texas. It's a unique kind of gymnasium run by David Vobora. The gym provides free personalized physical training programs for injured veterans and people living with disabilities as a way to fulfill its mission, which is, quote, to empower the human athlete, restore hope through movement, and redefine the limits of individuals with disabilities. A picture of what they do there is seen in the relationship between David Vobora and Brian Aft. The two met when Brian was on the street trying to manage the devastating effects of his heroin addiction. Aft, a Marine veteran and double amputee who lost both legs from a roadside bomb in Afghanistan in 2011. Like so many people whose addiction to painkillers led them to heroin use, Aft was now living on the street. One day, Vobora, driving by in his car, saw him, recognized in him something familiar. Vobora is a former NFL linebacker whose own life went off the rails due to his addiction to painkillers that he was prescribed to manage a shoulder injury. Vobora slammed on his brakes of his car, jumped out, ran up to Aft, and said, I'm David Vobora, a former NFL player. What happened? Aft told his story, and Vobora invited him to join him in the gym in order to find his life again and to change his future. Aft had been a strong, self-reliant Marine and felt he had lost himself and was no longer the man that he once was. Well, Vobora knew this same sense of loss after leaving football and becoming an addict to painkillers. So this invitation to come to the gym came from a man who knew what it meant to, quote, get well. An article in ESPN magazine describes the scene in the gym this way. They form a loose circle, some sitting in wheelchairs, others in folding chairs with their prosthetic legs or arms stretched out in front. A few, with their prosthetics removed, rest on their stumps on the floor. Others stand holding crutches or leaning on gym equipment. A quadruple amputee sits next to a triple amputee. A car crash survivor with no legs sits beside a veteran with one arm and one leg. Two quadriplegics confer on a single leg press amputee. They're all here, all at Oak Fit Gym on a rundown street outside of Dallas's downtown. Vobora and Aft described what is happening at the Oak Fit Gym as more than just adapted physical training. People are getting new stories and new solutions. They are pulling, rolling, lifting, pushing, growing in mind and body. They are, quote, walking again. Subtitle, chapter subtitle. Religion that benefits people, not the other way around. In this gospel story, our narrator is quick to add that this happened on the Sabbath. Jesus comes under considerable criticism in this story because he performs the healing on that Sabbath day. Not only is the story about a person with a new perspective and a new ability to walk, it's also about unraveling the power structures that keep people down. The Jewish religious leaders of Jesus' day were committed to keeping the Sabbath, and for good reason. The Sabbath was rooted in the story of the Hebrew faith right from the beginning. Unlike many of the religious laws of the day that were formed at the time of Moses, the keeping of the Sabbath, that one went all the way back to the creation narrative. The Hebrew people included a day of rest in their creation narrative to underline the importance that they already believed in the Sabbath to have. In the faith, keeping the Sabbath was necessary because even God rested on the Sabbath. Quote, "On the sixth day, God completed all the work that he had done, and on the seventh day, God rested from all the work that had been done. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work of creation." Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3. You can see how people who wanted themselves to be holy would want to honor a day that was made holy because God rested on it. The Jewish leaders understood that this was not the literal resting of God. They understood that this creation story was showing that the Sabbath was a special and holy day. They understood, as we would, the use of anthropomorphic language around God to give something meaning. And this was just the point. This was a day that should be kept holy, and people should, quote, "be like God" and rest on that day. So, over the centuries, there was considerable debate and clarity sought about what constituted work and what meant rest. Jesus seems to be picking a fight with the Sabbath-keeping requirement all the way through the Gospels. As he said, the Sabbath was made to benefit humanity. Humans were not made to keep the Sabbath. Jesus responded to the religious leaders who objected to doing this healing on the Sabbath day by saying, "My Father is still working, and I'm working too." Here we see Jesus referring to these works, arguing that he is the one who's in line with the actions of God, who is always working, creating, and making new humanity. The response of the leaders to turn against Jesus and want to kill him. The text gives the reason for this violent response. Quote, not only because he was doing away with the Sabbath, but because he was calling God his own Father and thereby making himself equal with God. So, on that day, when Jesus said, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk," there was a significant double meaning. Jesus was saying that the man was freed from this limitation and no longer had to sit on the mat, and that because this work of God was done on the Sabbath, the people no longer had to fear that there were some days when God is not on their side. Did Jesus have a twinkle in his eyes when he released this man from the story that he was trapped in, that there were rules to when and how you could be healed? Whether it was the timing to get in the water or having to have the right people help you get in the water. There's nothing more important than the healing of a person. This is a greater than work that people are doing today, freeing people from the limitations that some places or days are set aside for religious purposes at the expense of people themselves. In addition to the broad implication of Jesus' work, we cannot overlook that the man was able to walk afterward. People are continuing to do work in human sciences in the most amazing ways. The significant advancements in biology, cell regeneration, transplants, artificial limbs, implants, and the like over the last century, they're mind-blowing. And there is no indication that this is slowing down anytime soon. By modern standards, this story of making someone well so he can walk seems to be the most repeatable of all the miraculous signs. We've gotten really good at helping people walk. In fact, there's a group called the Amputee Coalition. You can find them at www.amputee-coalition.org. And they tell the history of prosthetics going back to the first patient for the artificial leg on November 4th, 1846. But they also go all the way back to the ancient Egyptians in an article called A Brief History of Prosthesis. We learn that the prosthetic field has morphed into a sophisticated example of man's determination to do better, as they say it. The Walk Again Project, it's an international collaboration effort involving more than 100 researchers. They built a system that allowed Juliano Pinto, who was paralyzed below the chest, to attend the ceremonial ball at the opening of the 2014 FIFA World Cup. They strapped Pinto inside of a robotic exoskeleton and connected a, quote, brain-machine interface, a BMI, that allowed him to control the exoskeleton with his thoughts. As impressive as it sounds to control a custom-fitted robotic device, an indication of the even more miraculous-sounding work being done in the area of neuroengineering can be seen in the title of an abstract in the Journal of Neuroengineering and Rehabilitation called, get a load of this, The Feasibility of a Brain-Computer Interface Functional Electrical Stimulation System for the Restoration of Overground Walking After Paraplegia. The article describes that through the proof of concept study, it's feasible to restore brain-controlled overground walking after damage to the spine. This means that spinal cord stimulation can allow a person to voluntarily move his or her lower extremities by an intuitive and direct brain control. In 2015, a 26-year-old man who had been paralyzed for 5 years due to damage to his spine did that very thing. The man wore an electrode cap that sent brain waves wirelessly to a computer that deciphered the waves and passed the intentions into a microcontroller on his belt, which then triggered his nerves to move the muscles in his legs. He was able to walk just over 10 feet using his own legs. The possibility of allowing persons with damaged spines to control their legs with their own brain waves is, in my book, one of those greater than accomplishments that this book and Jesus' call is all about. The amazing work continues in ways that must feel as miraculous to us as the works of Jesus did to the people of the first century. Throughout development in stem research and stem cell research, it's only a matter of time before we know how to help our bodies generate limbs and organs that they need. There is great promise in the area of using mathematical algorithms to create therapies that allow people to grow organs and limbs. As totally mind-blowing as that may sound, researchers from the Duke NUS Medical School in Singapore, the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, Monash University in Australia, and Riken in Japan have published their work in a journal called Nature Genetics. We've gone far beyond the healing and wholeness environment and have entered into the fantastical world of allowing the body to generate limbs and organs. This kind of thing may frighten you just a bit and give you a cause to find solidarity with the religious leaders of Jesus' day who accused him of trying to equate himself with God, as you wonder if we've crossed some predetermined limit of humanity. Well, I don't see it that way. I think we're just getting started on the greater works that are possible. So there it is. That's chapter 6, Empowerment, that comes to us from the book Outdoing Jesus. So hope you enjoyed that one. And I'm just going to check into Facebook here real quick and see if there's anything I need to respond to. And I think we're doing well. If you want to shoot a comment over about this when you've watched it later, I'd be glad to answer it. So thanks all.